see that cute tourist train? I took that today just to get a bit of a scope for the city. It's a beautiful tourist town. I mean, come on, look at all those yachts there. Look at those unbelievable buildings with the red tile roof, the church cathedral up on the hill, an old fortress there. I mean, this is one of the prettiest cities in France. It's on the Mediterranean. The weather is gorgeous, 85 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees Celsius. Look at that, all these little cafes. What a delightful way to spend the afternoon. But walk with me 30 feet this way, and I'll show you the other part of Marseille, because I've spent a couple of days poking around town, not just on the tourist train and the cafes, but just a few blocks away. It's a 70-80% Muslim streets and neighborhoods, and you can even see, literally feet away from the promenade, Nahel. That's a reference in graffiti to Nahel Merzouk, the young man of Algerian descent, 17 years old, who was killed by police. That's just his name, Nahel. But throughout Marseille, at least the parts we walked in, there's graffiti that says Justice pour Nahel, justice pour Nahel, and much more ominously, Nick the police, which is F the police, ACAB, all cops are bastards, and tuer le police. Sometimes the grammar is not strong. We even saw an image in graffiti of a submachine gun. Kill the police. We're staying in the tourist district, but even that, the riots came so close that last night the hotel itself had a security guard posted out, because literally in the same block, windows were smashed. There are parts of town 2 blocks from this gorgeous tourist facade where every single window and wall is either boarded up or graffitied or both. Last night we looked for the action, but it's difficult. France is a country larger than the state of California. Even if you have 100 incidents, which there were last night, by the time you find out about them and try and get there, it's likely over. And trying to find a vehicle to take you there, we were unable to secure that since we came to France on very short notice. We were stationed with a sort of a staging area of police in the city here, and they never deployed. We did see, however, lots of fire trucks going by with their sirens on. There were over 300 cars torched last night, and as you may have seen in my earlier video, cars weren't just torched, they were still, in fact, I don't know if you can hear in the background, there's sirens all the time. Maybe those are just the sirens of normal life, but last night they were certainly sirens responding to burnt cars. A quick reference to cars. It's an easy way for people, young people, to smash the establishment, I suppose. I don't know if you saw my video outside a Volkswagen dealership. Young people broke in, stole the master set of keys, or all the keys, and drove off with more than 40 cars. Here's a quick clip of that. Last night, before nightfall, I walked down some of these beautiful cafes. The ones here are largely tourists or French people. And many of the staff in this area are either French or very assimilated Muslim immigrants to France. I was in one coffee shop, and I noticed this poster, not in a prominent place, but it was displayed in the main room. It was a poster putting a beautiful face forward, saying that in France we don't cover our faces. And it didn't come right out and say it, but it had a link to the government law against veils. As you may know, some strict interpretations of Islam require that women be covered from head to toe, including their face. That's illegal in France, which explains why I actually haven't seen it, even though I have seen women in the head-to-toe abaya showing their face. But I have seen a workaround. COVID. I have seen some Muslim women head to toe, and they're wearing a black mask in the name of COVID. Isn't that ironic that was how they came around that law? But there's a tension. I mentioned again that poster I saw was in a coffee shop run by Muslim people. There are many Muslim people here who have been here for decades in their family. Remember that France had colonies in Muslim parts of the world. Napoleon himself was fighting battles. If you look at the Arc de Triomphe, you'll see the names of the great battles he was in, from Gaza to Syria to the Sphinx. And some critics of imperialism and colonization, including this professor in Detroit, said France was happy to have Muslim colonies for more than a century, and yet now it quarrels with the fact that there are Muslims in France proper. You have to admit he has a bit of a point. He's an activist and an agitator, but every once in a while he makes a good point like this one. France is delighted to have Muslim immigrants when they help him win the soccer World Cup. But how can people who come from Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco and many other places — we saw Muslim migrants here from sub-Saharan Africa, from Turkey, from Iraq — how do they become French? I asked some men who I saw on the coffee shops, and my point is these coffee shops are men and women. These coffee shops, women are dressed, I wouldn't say scantily, but it's very warm here, so there's women wearing shorts and halter tops. This is the westernized coffee shops, but you go just a few streets away, and I pointed out to my producer, Ephron, there are coffee shops where you'll have 50 people out enjoying the sun, sipping on coffee, and there's not a single woman amongst them. They have the affectation of a French coffee shop. They're having tea or coffee and maybe a croissant, but there are no women, which is the very Parisian thing, isn't it, to see a beautiful woman dressed up having coffee outside a coffee shop. Not here. I'm not saying there are no women allowed in coffee shops, but there are some that are quite segregated. And one of the things I think of as I look at the demographics of France, especially in Marseille, where they're very much progressed, is this gorgeous image here. I don't know, I've never been to Marrakesh or Casablanca or other beautiful cities in northern Africa. I just haven't been there. But there may come a time when Marseille still has the beautiful buildings. No one's going to tear them down. Still has this beautiful port. No one's going to fill it in. There will always be people who love their boats, but maybe it won't be French Marseille. Maybe it'll be more like a Moroccan Marseille, which is a pretty nice place, I hear, but it's just not as free. It's just not as secular, and it's not as diverse, to use a word. There was one man I spoke to last night. There were a number of Muslim men I spoke to who said, I'm absolutely French. I'm French in my heart. And I am against the act of killing Nahel, but I'm against all violence. I asked some of these men, is France systemically racist? And I also said, if it is, why did you come here? And some of the men said, no. There's pockets of racism just like there are back in Algeria. I found those tremendously hopeful answers. But typically the people who were saying those were people who were more moderate in their Islam to begin with. I tried to speak to some people who were clearly more fundamentalist. The men were wearing head-to-toe robes. And granted, there was a language barrier. My French is atrocious, but I managed to eke out a conversation with other people in French. I think people who are truly fundamentalist in their beliefs wouldn't talk to a journalist to begin with. The more liberal the Muslim man I spoke with, I encountered no women willing to speak, the more they were talking about how they loved France. But I want to refer to one conversation I had with a man who looked fairly integrated. He dressed fairly Western. He had a beard, but it was fairly trimmed. I asked him some questions, and he gave fairly good answers. But in the end, and one of the things he said was that, and I had this conversation with several men, is that France wouldn't accept newcomers because of racism, and I think he implied anti-Islamic feeling. And one of the things he mentioned was the ban on the veil. So he said he was not accepted. He was not treated as a real Frenchman by the French. And I think there's probably some truth to that. But then I asked him, I said, in your heart, are you a Frenchman first or an Algerian first? And a number of the men said Algerian first. And one man, I have to get a better translation because he spoke to me in both French and Arabic, and I don't speak any Arabic. He answered basically a fundamentalist Islamic answer. I want to confirm that with a proper translation. And so my point is, if you're a newcomer to France and you want to be accepted as French and you want to be integrated in society, I think that's a two-way street. I think, yes, you need the police to treat you equally with ethnic French people. But you yourself must put France first, at least in the realm of public life.
Dans votre cœur. Êtes-vous algérien ou français dans votre cœur?
Moi, oui, bien sûr l'Algérie.
Mais vous, à dire à moi que les autres Français disrespect, are not fair to you, disrespect you, parce que vous n'êtes pas un vrai Français. Mais vous a dit que vous êtes algérien.
Oui, moi je suis algérien et ça c'est mon frère. Et ça c'est mon frère aussi. On a arrêté pour vécu on est en France parce que la France c'est mieux. Bon, par exemple, le côté médical, côté de vivre, beaucoup de choses. Beaucoup de choses. C'est pas comme la Suisse, parce que tu vas aller dire, moi je vis en Suisse. En Suisse, c'est un peu dur, c'est pas comme la France.
La France est-elle raciste?
Hein?
France. Ouais. Raciste? Raciste?
Raciste dans quel domaine? Il y a des domaines, il y a beaucoup de domaines. Dans quel domaine raciste?
Pourquoi millions de musulmans d'Algérie, Tunisie, immigrés à France si France est raciste?
Je dis, il y a des racistes, il y a des gens normaux, ils acceptent les Algériens, ils aiment les Algériens, il travaille avec les Algériens.
Et Algérie?
Hein?
Algérie, les racistes en Algérie aussi?
Oui.
Pardon.
Il y a un raciste.
You know, being French is an ethnicity. It just is. It's a nationality. And no one was more proud and more nationalistic, even chauvinistic, even arrogant about being French than their great president, Charles de Gaulle. In fact, his name literally means Charles the French. Gaul was what the Romans called France. And he was asked, can a foreigner become French truly? And this was asked in the context of French colonies overseas in places like Algeria and Tunisia. And this chauvinistic, nationalistic, some would say even authoritarian leader said, yes. He said, yes, you can become French. You just have to truly become French. You have to speak the language. You have to learn the literature, the history, the culture. You have to know who we are, and you have to be a part of it. To be a part of it. So he said yes, he emphasized the assimilation and the integration. And I think that's maybe what's missing. If you have masses of immigrants and they have a higher fertility rate than old stock French, not only is the new immigration, but the fact that the Muslim immigrants are having more babies, if you do not inculcate a Frenchness in this new community, you will no longer be French in a matter of time. It'll be like the great city of Malmö in Sweden that is half Muslim, but it has a completely Muslim future. And even Muslim kids born in Malmo, Sweden, are just as fundamentalist, in fact, probably more fundamentalist than a Muslim growing up, certainly in a place like the United Arab Emirates. I want to read to you from an amazing speech that President Emmanuel Macron gave in 2020, and he gave it in the context of what was happening in the United States, which was the Black Lives Matter riots, the racialized warfare that was going on then. And Macron gave this speech as a group of new citizens were being sworn in, including some from Muslim lands. And so he was there cheering and celebrating them becoming immigrants to France. So he was certainly not anti-immigrant. United Kingdom, Algeria, Cameroon, Peru, and Lebanon. And I want to read to you from a translation of Macron's speech, and I'm going to read about 5 minutes of it, because I think it'll actually change, it'll inform you about France. It'll make you think highly of Emmanuel Macron, even though he really hasn't lived up to this speech. And it'll give you some thoughts to think about how to integrate immigrants, not just in France, but in our countries too, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in the United States. I'm going to read. He says, to become French, this means, in effect, accepting being more than an individual pursuing private interests, but a citizen contributing to the common good. Okay, that doesn't really say a lot yet, other than it says you have to have a life outside of your own. You have to be part of a bigger thing. I think that's obvious, but how? In what way? And he goes on, he says, it gives proof of responsibility to one's compatriots and the cultivation of a fully Republican virtue. And by Republican, he doesn't mean the U.S. political party. He means the Republic of France. He said, the Republic is always fragile and precarious, and it must therefore be a battle at every dawn, a conquest of every day, a Republican patriotism every moment. The Republic is not a given, never completed, and I say that here today for our youth, it is a conquest. So he's saying building the country of France is a great project that you have to be a part of. He's making it sound like an adventure. And he explains what kind of adventure, and this goes to the old French revolutionary concepts of liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Liberty, first of all. Liberty, liberty, beloved, resounds La Marseillaise. So he says that even their anthem says liberty, liberty, beloved. That's very bold, isn't it? That's just as strong as any talk of freedom in the Canadian or American anthem. This is Macron's speech at the swearing in of these new immigrants. To be French means, first of all, loving liberty passionately. De Gaulle evoked the 2,000-year-old pact between France and the liberty of the world. Starting today, you are bound by that pact. So he's saying you have responsibilities to promote freedom as a French citizen. Isn't that incredible? I hate to say it, but I like Macron more and more reading this speech. It is a liberty to participate in the choice of its leaders, and therefore the right to vote, which is, however, inextricably tied to accepting the electoral decisions. So he says, you play the game of democracy, but you must accept the outcome even if your side loses. That's a very powerful point. The collective liberty of the people. It is the liberty of conscience, and in particular the secularism, this arrangement unique in the world that guarantees the freedom to believe or not to believe, and which is not separable from a liberty of expression that goes as far as the right to engage in blasphemy. And I say this at the moment when the trial of the assassinations of January 2015 is beginning. So he's speaking about Islamic terrorism. He's saying France is secular. This will not be an Islamic regime. That's who he's talking about. Those are the only people calling for a religious regime. This is bold talk. I regret to say this talk from 3 years ago was not manifest here in Marseille or any other part of France. I'll keep reading. Being French, and could you imagine Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak, or Justin Trudeau saying this? This is Emmanuel Macron. He said, being French means defending the right to laugh, the right to deride, the right to mock, and the right to caricature, of which Voltaire claimed that it is the source of all other rights. Being French means always being on the side of the fighters of liberty, and all the more so when renunciations flourish and censorship spreads. He's talking about caricatures of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. He was saying this. He was welcoming immigrants in, but telling them the rules. So that was liberty. He talks about equality. I won't read too much, but let me just give you a little bit. Being French means recognizing in every woman and every man the same dignity. Again, that's a comment on Islam, isn't it? I met a fellow on the patio yesterday who was outraged that the veil blocking women's faces was banned in France.
il faut que la France arrête le racisme. Le racisme à la télé, c'est trop. Ils discriminent trop la race musulmane. Ah, la femme voilée, elle aussi, ça, laissez les gens vivre comme ils veulent. Voilà, c'est tout ce que j'ai à dire.
Then he talks about égalité, the next part of liberté, égalité, fraternity. And I'm not going to read a ton, but look at who he starts to talk about. The very first thing he talks about is gender equality. Why? Well, you heard that fella yesterday who told me he's outraged that the veil is banned in France. Here's what Macron said. Equality. Being French means recognizing in every woman and every man the same dignity. Being French means loving justice. He talks about universal suffrage, the rights of women to vote. I'm going to skip ahead. He talks about fraternity. He says, being French means viewing one's compatriot as more than an equal or a challenge. Our nation is special because it developed a welfare state, a model of social protection that leaves no one by the way. Yet this system, unique in the world, only works thanks to bonds, always fragile, that unite our citizens. Bonds of respect and civility that can be broken at any moment by violence and hatred. Therefore, in the Republic, the police, constables, magistrates, mayors, the elected representatives of the Republic, and more generally all those who fight against violence, racism, and anti-Semitism, play a determining role in whose symmetrically anyone who attacks them must be severely condemned in terms of the law and never arbitrarily. I'm not going to read the whole speech, but it is a bracing speech, and it shows that Emmanuel Macron, even if he doesn't do what he says, at least said it. I put it to you that speech would not be given by most presidents or prime ministers in the West. And I put it to you that speech is not yet being manifest here in France. There is not liberty, freedom of expression in the same way that there was a decade ago in France. There are still assassinations and threats against those who criticize Islam. There's certainly not fraternity, and there's certainly not equality. You can see that even in this city. You could see slowly, a new underclass, a kind of self-imposed ghettoization, a kind of apartheid, to get right down to it, is happening in Marseille, and it's happening in every major city in this country. And because they're not integrated, this new community, there's a resentment there. I think this is a two-sided problem. I think the first thing that France has to do is decide if it wants immigrants to France who do not want to become French. And I think it has to do something about it. It's not enough just to give a speech. I think France has to make it clear that newcomers, including Muslim newcomers, can have full participation in life. And I think Macron was saying that. And that's met with a duty by newcomers to truly become French, as de Gaulle insisted they must. I don't know, I have to say that when I look at this beautiful background behind me, I get the feeling that this city will be beautiful for centuries to come. But it may much more resemble a gorgeous city like Casablanca or Marrakesh that's beautiful but not fully free and not really with the qualities of liberté, égalité, and fraternity. I think that this city is changing. It had a good run for centuries. I don't know what its future is. I think it'll always be fine for the very rich and those able to get protection for themselves, hire private police. I think they'll always maintain some sort of tourism here. It's just too valuable. But unless they integrate this new community that has really grown in the last 30 years, I think the violence of the last week is just a foreshadowing of a deeper civil war that has clearly attracted ethnic solidarity across France and even in other parts of Europe like Belgium and Switzerland. This is a difficult problem. And if you think this problem is isolated in Europe and will never come to Canada or the United States, I think you're mistaken. If we, like Macron, merely talk about acculturating and integrating newcomers, but don't do anything about it. Those are some of my thoughts on this beautiful, beautiful day. The sun is over its peak. It's now the afternoon, and it's in the early evening that the riots pick up again. Last night there were over 100 incidents, 300 plus cars damaged. There were arrests. It's certainly much less than it was earlier in the week. We're going to try and go to a site that was torched last night. It's about a 45-minute drive from here. We're going to see if anyone at that site will talk to us today and what the damage looks like. For more on our trip to Marseille, France, and our coverage of the riots, go to franceonfire.com.